It was just after midnight when the lights shifted. Not flashing, not dramatic, just a subtle movement in a place where movement wasn't supposed to happen at that hour. 12:47 a.m. That's the time that keeps coming up. Not because it's symbolic, not because it sounds cinematic, but because multiple people remember checking their phones afterward, confused about why they were suddenly wide awake, why something felt off. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Prince Harry wasn't heading to a late dinner. He wasn't returning from an event. He wasn't being chased by paparazzi or waved through by security in a rush. He was leaving his own home, quietly. And here's the part that makes people pause when they tell the story. No, one remembers seeing him come back. For a couple that has built an entire public identity around control, control of narrative, control of access, control of privacy, this was a moment that didn't fit. Not loudly, not obviously, just enough to make you lean in. Why midnight? Why alone? Why now? At first, it barely registered beyond the neighborhood. Montecito is used to famous people behaving strangely. That's almost the job description of the place. Actors disappear for weeks. Tech founders arrive at dawn and vanish by dusk. Silence is normal here. Discretion is currency. Which is why what happened next mattered. Not immediately, not explosively, but gradually, like a pressure change you don't notice until your ears start ringing. Because when a few neighbors began comparing notes, not gossiping, not speculating wildly, just noticing, the story shifted from odd to unsettling. Not because of what they saw, because of what they didn't. Let me be very clear before we go any further. This is not a story built on one person's account or a single whisper or an anonymous DM sent at 3 a.m. This is about patterns, absences, timing, human behavior that doesn't quite line up with the version we've all been shown. And it's about why those discrepancies are surfacing now. Ask yourself this. If everything was fine, truly fine, would a prince slip out of his own house under cover of night? Maybe. There are innocent explanations for almost everything. But when innocent explanations start stacking up on top of one another, they stop feeling innocent. They start feeling rehearsed. What makes this moment different isn't just Harry's departure, it's what followed. Or rather, what didn't. No clarification. No casual photo drop a few days later to reset the narrative. No friendly, everything's great moments slip to a favorite outlet. Just silence. And silence, in this context, is never empty. For years, the Sussex strategy has been remarkably consistent. When pressure builds, something releases it. A statement, a story, a project, a reframe. That's not a criticism. It's an observation. It's how modern public figures survive. But this time, the release valve didn't open, which raises an uncomfortable question. What happens when you can't control the next chapter because you're not sure who's watching anymore? This story matters now because the timing is wrong in a way that can't be smoothed over with PR language. Because people who are used to not talking are talking, carefully, reluctantly, often prefacing their comments with, "I probably shouldn't say this, but..." And because the implications stretch far beyond a single marriage or a single family, they cut into credibility itself. Trust. The unspoken agreement between public figures and the public, you don't need to tell us everything. Just don't lie to us. That's the tension humming beneath all of this. As the midnight departure became a topic of quiet conversation, something else began to surface alongside it. Not shouted, not even confidently stated. More like a question people were afraid to finish out loud. Have you ever noticed? Have you ever actually seen? Do you find it strange that these weren't accusations? They were observations searching for context, neighbors talking about routines, or the lack of them, about mornings that never seemed to start, about afternoons that never sounded like what you'd expect from a home with young children. And before you jump to conclusions, pause. So did they. Most of them dismissed the thought almost immediately. Of course there are children. Of course there are explanations. Nannies, security, travel, privacy measures so extreme they erase visible traces of normal life. Except the thought kept returning, not because anyone wanted it to. Because once you notice an absence, it's very hard to unnotice it. Here's where the story becomes uncomfortable and why it's taken so long to reach this point. Montecito is not a place where people speak freely about their neighbors, especially when those neighbors are globally famous and legally fortified. People here know how quickly a casual comment can turn into a headline, a lawsuit, or worse. So for a long time, nothing happened. Harry and Meghan appeared when they wanted to appear, released images when they wanted images released, controlled angles, moments, timelines. And for most of the world, that was enough, until it wasn't. Because the gap between public image and private observation began to widen. And gaps invite scrutiny, whether you want them to or not. This is where I need to slow down and be precise. No one is claiming certainty here. No one is presenting proof. What exists instead is something far more dangerous in the public sphere: unresolved doubt. And doubt doesn't need facts to spread. It needs silence. It needs behavior that contradicts expectation. It needs moments like a husband leaving his home at midnight and not offering a reason, not even a vague one. What makes this moment particularly volatile is the emotional backdrop. Over the past year, there have been subtle but noticeable shifts, missed appearances, separate movements. Body language that doesn't scream crisis but whispers distance. If you've ever watched a relationship unravel from the outside, you know the signs aren't dramatic at first. They're logistical, scheduling, tone, who shows up, who doesn't, and who leaves. Which brings us back to that night. Because once people started paying attention to the departure, they started paying attention to everything else. How often Harry was seen alone? How often Meghan wasn't seen at all? How carefully managed every public glimpse became, as if spontaneity itself had become a liability. And then came the most unsettling part of all: the realization that no one could agree on the last time they'd seen the children in any unplanned context. Not a wave from a car window, not a stroller passing by unexpectedly, not a fleeting accidental moment that wasn't framed, timed, or filtered. Again, pause. That doesn't mean what some people think it means. But it does mean something. At the very least, it means a level of control so total that it's begun to feel unnatural even to those accustomed to privacy. And at worst, it means there's a reason that control can't slip. Ask yourself this, honestly. If you lived next door to a family with young children, how long would it take before you noticed signs of life? Laughter, chaos, noise, motion. Now ask yourself how long it would take before the absence of those things became noticeable. This isn't about conspiracy. It's about human pattern recognition. And that's why this story refuses to die. Because it doesn't hinge on one outrageous claim. It hinges on a series of quiet moments that don't quite add up. A midnight exit, a house that feels frozen in time, a public narrative that keeps insisting everything is fine, while the private reality feels increasingly sealed. And somewhere in the middle of all this sits a marriage under pressure. Not necessarily explosive, not necessarily over, but strained in a way that changes how people move through their own lives. People don't flee at midnight when they're at peace. They don't leave silently when they feel secure. And they don't invite this level of speculation unless something has already shifted behind closed doors. What's coming next in this story isn't about proving anything. It's about understanding how we got here, about tracing the small decisions that led to this moment, about listening carefully to what's being said and what's being avoided. Because the next piece doesn't come from rumor. It comes from a witness who noticed something that night that no one has been able to explain away since. And once you hear what they saw or didn't see, the entire timeline starts to feel very different. Did anyone actually see who he was with? That's the question that keeps resurfacing, not because it's scandalous, but because it refuses to settle. When people talk about that night now, they don't start with Harry. They start with the space around him, the shape of the moment, the absence of what should have been obvious. One neighbor described it as too clean, not visually, logistically, like a scene that had been prepared to leave as little trace as possible. No raised voices, no lights snapping on in surrounding houses. No visible hesitation, just movement, purposeful, quiet. And then the car was gone. Here's where the story gets delicate, because it would be very easy to inflate this into something it isn't. Plenty of people leave their homes late at night. Plenty of marriages survive worse than midnight exits. Plenty of rumors dissolve once daylight hits. But this one didn't, because what followed didn't feel like a return to normal. It felt like a holding pattern. Over the next few days, nothing publicly shifted. No photos, no sightings, no casual mention slipped into a press piece about a busy week at home. That's unusual not because silence is suspicious, but because this particular silence didn't serve anyone. It didn't protect privacy. It didn't reset the narrative. It just sat there, unresolved. One resident, someone who's lived in the area long enough to know how these things usually go, Put it this way, when celebrities want you to stop wondering, they give you something small to latch onto. A smile, a coffee run, a carefully staged normal moment. Something that says, you can relax. Nothing to see here. This time, there was nothing. And when there's nothing, people fill in the gaps themselves. That's not malicious. It's human. The whispers didn't start as accusations. They started as logistics. Who was home? Who wasn't? Had anyone seen security shift patterns? Did the gate open the next morning the way it usually did? Those kinds of questions don't feel dramatic in real time. They feel practical, almost boring, until you realize how many people are asking them independently. What caught attention wasn't that Harry left. It was that his leaving didn't seem to disrupt anything. No visible scramble, no reaction ripple, no sign that anyone else had been surprised by it. As if the exit had been anticipated, as if it had been planned. And that's where the story edges into uncomfortable territory, because planning implies preparation. And preparation implies that whatever was happening had already been discussed, already weighed, already decided to some extent. People don't usually plan their exits unless staying has become untenable. Here's another detail that keeps surfacing in conversations, always mentioned cautiously, almost apologetically. The car wasn't driven fast, no urgency, no panic. That matters. Urgency suggests crisis. Calm suggests resolve. Ask yourself which one is more unsettling. A rushed departure can be explained away. A calm one is harder to dismiss. One neighbor said they only noticed the car because they were already awake, unsettled by something they couldn't name. That's subjective, of course. Memory reshapes itself. Nights blur. But what stuck with them was the lack of drama. No argument spilling into the driveway. No door slamming, just a man leaving as if he'd done it before. Had he? That's the question no one has been able to answer. And once that question takes root, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads sideways into other observations, other moments that once seemed insignificant. Like how often Harry had been seen arriving separately in recent weeks. Like how schedules that used to overlap suddenly didn't. Like how public appearances began to feel more like obligations than reflections of a shared life. None of this proves anything. It doesn't need to. It creates a texture, a sense that the story being presented doesn't quite match the one being lived. And when texture builds, people start looking for corroboration. This is where neighbors begin to matter, not as sources of gossip, but as accidental witnesses. People who didn't ask to be part of a narrative but find themselves inside one anyway. They notice patterns because they have nothing else to do but live their lives nearby. Morning routines, evening rhythms, weekends that feel oddly static. One person mentioned that weekends used to feel different, louder, somehow. Not noisy, exactly. Just active, cars coming and going. A sense of movement. Then, at some point, that changed. No one can pinpoint when. It wasn't abrupt, it faded. And that's often how relational shifts happen. Not with explosions, but with quiet withdrawals. Which brings us back to the house itself. It's a strange thing to describe a home that way, especially one so heavily fortified, so deliberately hidden. From the outside, it's a fortress of privacy. From the inside, at least as inferred by those nearby, it began to feel more like a holding space than a living environment. Security remained tight, privacy remained absolute. But life became harder to detect. Again, pause here. This isn't about making claims. It's about acknowledging that perception exists, and perception influences narrative whether it's fair or not. When public figures demand privacy, they're also demanding trust. Trust that what they choose to share is representative, even if it's selective. The trouble starts when what's shared begins to feel disconnected from reality. When curated moments don't just feel edited, but insulated. When spontaneity disappears entirely, that's when people start wondering what's being protected. And who? Another neighbor recalled something that didn't seem important at the time. A delivery that never came, or rather, a pattern of deliveries that stopped. Small things, household things. The kind of things families with children tend to need constantly. Diapers, supplies, toys, things that arrive even when you don't notice them consciously. Their absence isn't proof of anything, but absence accumulates. It becomes a presence of its own. This is the danger zone of any investigation, the place where observation starts to blur into interpretation. That's why restraint matters here. That's why it's important not to leap. But restraint doesn't mean ignoring signals. It means cataloging them carefully. And when you line them up, the midnight departure, the calmness of it, the lack of visible disruption, the prolonged silence afterward, the shifting routines, the increasingly sealed public image, a question begins to form whether you want it to or not. What exactly is being held together here, and for how long? Because marriages don't usually unravel in public, they unravel in private first, through small decisions, through distance disguised as logistics, through exits that don't come with explanations because the explanations have already been exhausted internally. People close to the situation, not neighbors now, but those tangentially connected, have described a change in tone. Less humor, more caution. Conversations that feel managed rather than natural. That's not uncommon under pressure, but sustained pressure leaves marks. It changes how people move, how they speak, how they leave, which brings us back, once again, to the night itself. Because one witness noticed something that doesn't align with the idea of a temporary break or a cooling off period, something subtle, almost easy to miss. The car wasn't packed for a night away. It was packed for longer. Not dramatically, no suitcases stacked high, but enough. Enough to suggest intention beyond impulse. That observation has been debated, questioned, doubted. Memory is tricky. Perception is subjective, but it refuses to disappear from the narrative. Because if that's true, if the departure wasn't just emotional but logistical, then the timeline shifts. The story becomes less about a moment and more about a process that didn't start that night, a process that may already have been well underway. And if that's the case, then the next question becomes unavoidable. If Harry was leaving something behind, what was he leaving behind exactly? And who was still inside the house when the lights went out? Because according to one person, someone who noticed the detail that no one else did, the most telling part of that night wasn't who left. It was who didn't appear at all. And once you understand what they mean by that, the story stops being about a midnight exit and starts being about a disappearance that may have happened long before anyone realized they should be looking for it. What does a house sound like when no one is really living in it? Not empty. Empty has an echo. Empty announces itself. This was different. People struggled to describe it at first because there isn't a word for a place that is occupied but inert, guarded but unmoving, lit but not alive. One neighbor said it felt like the house was always waiting for something that never arrived. Morning would come, the sun would hit the hedges at the same angle it always did, security would be present, unchanged, gates would open and close on schedule. And yet, no rhythm, no variation, no sense that the day inside had actually begun. You don't notice that kind of thing immediately. It creeps in slowly, like realizing a clock has stopped only after you've checked it 3 times and the hands haven't moved. At first, people assumed they were just missing moments. Of course, you don't see everything. Of course, life happens behind walls. Of course, this family values privacy more than most. But privacy still leaks. Children leak noise, movement, chaos, a dropped toy, a sudden rush to get somewhere late. A different kind of energy that even the best soundproofing can't fully erase. And that energy, according to multiple people nearby, simply wasn't there. Again, this wasn't framed as suspicion at the beginning. It was framed as curiosity, mild confusion, the kind of observation you brush off because it feels impolite to linger on it. Then, one person mentioned it to another, then another, and suddenly, without anyone intending it, a pattern began to form. The house felt preserved, not lived in, preserved. Think about the difference. A lived-in home evolves constantly. Furniture shifts. Routines change. You can feel time passing. A preserved space resists time. It's maintained, but it doesn't grow. One neighbor described walking past on an afternoon that should have been loud, school hours ending, weekend approaching. That restless energy kids bring with them when they're about to burst out of whatever structure they've been held in all day. Instead, there was nothing. No hurried arrivals, no doors opening and closing in quick succession, no laughter carried on the air, even briefly. Just stillness. And stillness, when it stretches too long, stops feeling peaceful. It starts feeling staged. Here's where the internal conflict kicks in for anyone paying attention, because questioning this feels wrong, intrusive, almost cruel. No one wants to speculate about children. No one wants to be the person. And slowly, a coherent picture was forming, one that didn't align with the image the public had been shown. The public narrative suggested warmth, family, domesticity carefully protected from intrusion. The private observations suggested something colder, more controlled, less spontaneous. And when those two narratives collide, people instinctively start asking which one is closer to the truth. This is where irony creeps in, because the very measures designed to protect privacy may have amplified suspicion. By erasing randomness, they erased credibility. A fully controlled environment invites questions because it leaves no room for error, and error is how authenticity shows itself. Think about your own life. The moments that prove something is real are usually the moments that go slightly wrong. A misstep, a laugh at the wrong time, a noise you didn't mean to make. Here, nothing went wrong. Ever. That's not normal. One resident described it as too perfect in the wrong way, like a set that never gets reset because no one is actually using it. And then there's the matter of timing. Because if this level of silence had been present from the beginning, people might have accepted it as the price of extreme privacy. But several neighbors insisted that wasn't the case. They remember a different soundscape. Not loud, just alive. Cars arriving unpredictably, voices drifting occasionally, a sense that something was happening inside, even if you couldn't see it. Then, gradually, that faded. Not all at once. Not dramatically, just less and less and less, until silence became the default. That's the part people struggle with, because gradual changes are easy to dismiss in the moment. You only recognize them in hindsight, when a catalyst forces you to look back. The midnight departure was that catalyst. It didn't create the silence, it highlighted it. And once highlighted, it couldn't be ignored. This is where the children become central to the story, not as subjects, but as symbols. Children are uncontrollable variables. They introduce chaos into systems built on control. They force improvisation. If your life depends on narrative stability, children complicate things. That doesn't mean you eliminate them, but it does mean you manage their visibility carefully. And careful management, taken too far, stops looking like protection and starts looking like concealment. Again, pause. This is not an accusation. It's an observation about optics. And optics matter because they shape belief. One neighbor described feeling a kind of cognitive dissonance, seeing family-themed press releases while experiencing a neighborhood environment that felt anything but familial. That dissonance creates stress. It makes people uneasy even if they can't articulate why. And unease seeks resolution. So people started asking quieter questions. Not out loud, internally. What does a normal day look like inside that house? Who wakes up first? Who leaves? Who comes back? Who makes noise? And when no answers surfaced, those questions became heavier. Another detail surfaced around this time, mentioned almost reluctantly, emergency services, or rather, the lack of them. Families with young children, statistically speaking, interact with emergency services occasionally. Accidents happen, fevers spike, falls occur. That doesn't mean sirens constantly blare, but over time, some interaction usually happens. Here, none had been observed. That absence alone means nothing. But again, absence accumulates, and when it accumulates enough, it becomes presence. The most telling thing about all of this is how people reacted emotionally to noticing it. They didn't feel triumphant. They didn't feel excited. They felt uncomfortable because the implications are not sensational. They're disturbing. Disturbing because they challenge assumptions people have accepted for years. Disturbing because they raise questions no one wants answered. And disturbing because they don't point cleanly in one direction. Is this about extreme privacy taken to an extreme? Is this about logistical arrangements that simply look strange from the outside? Or is it about something more deliberate? That's where the story resists closure. And that resistance is what keeps people talking. One person said they tried to convince themselves that the silence was a kindness, a way of shielding children from a hostile world. But that explanation began to fray when they considered how total the silence was. Kindness usually leaves room for humanity. This left no room at all. Which brings us to the contradiction at the heart of this chapter. If the goal was to protect children, why did the strategy feel optimized for adults? Adults can comply with schedules. Children can't. Adults can understand rules, children break them. Adults can stay quiet. Children announce themselves. Yet everything about the environment seemed designed for compliance. And compliance implies control. That contradiction doesn't resolve easily. It lingers, it presses. It turns over in the mind late at night, which is why when someone with inside access finally spoke, not publicly, not formally, just in a moment of candor, it mattered so much. Because they didn't talk about what the children did. They talked about rules. Rules about noise. Rules about movement. Rules about when certain areas could be used. Rules that felt less like parenting and more like protocol. And when asked why those rules existed, the answer wasn't safety. It was consistency. Consistency for whom? That question hangs unanswered. Because consistency serves systems, not children. And systems don't exist for comfort. They exist for predictability. Which brings us to the next shift in this story. The moment people stopped asking whether the silence was accidental and started asking who benefited from it. Because once you follow that question, you don't end up where you expect. You end up somewhere far more complicated, somewhere that forces you to reconsider not just the house, but the people who built the narrative around it. And according to someone who saw the internal operation up close, the silence wasn't just encouraged, it was monitored. And once you understand how, the story stops being about missing noise and starts being about enforced quiet. When did the images stop lining up with time? That's the question that quietly replaces all the others once you've sat with this long enough. Not where the photos came from, not who approved them, but when exactly they were taken, and why that suddenly became harder to answer. Because here's the thing about curated images. They don't just show you what someone wants you to see, they also reveal what someone wants you not to notice. And once people started paying attention, the gaps between those moments began to feel less like privacy and more like insulation. At first glance, nothing looked wrong. A smiling frame here, a soft focus release there. Carefully composed, warmly lit, emotionally legible, the kind of imagery designed to reassure without oversharing. But reassurance only works if it aligns with lived experience. And increasingly, it didn't. Neighbors began noticing something subtle but persistent. The photos didn't feel anchored to real time. They appeared without context. No sense of before or after. No trace of a day unfolding around them. Just moments, isolated, static, sealed off. A picture without a timestamp isn't suspicious. But a pattern of pictures without context is something else entirely. Ask yourself this: when families share glimpses of their lives, even selectively, those glimpses usually imply continuity. A park visit suggests a drive there and back. A smile suggests a morning that led up to it. A moment implies a sequence. Here, the sequence was missing. Images arrived like postcards from nowhere. And the more people noticed that, the more uncomfortable it became. Because the absence of sequence isn't just an aesthetic choice. It's a strategy. A strategy that works best when the audience isn't paying attention. But people were paying attention now. Not out of hostility, out of confusion. Because when Harry left at midnight and nothing followed to contextualize it, no casual family image, no back to normal signal, it made every previous image feel retroactive, like it was doing more work than it should have had to do. Suddenly, people weren't asking what the photos showed, they were asking what they replaced. One resident described scrolling back through past releases and feeling something shift. Not alarm. Recognition. The sense that these images could have been taken at almost any point and released at almost any other. That flexibility is power. It allows you to compress time, to stretch it, to smooth over transitions that might otherwise raise questions. And for a long time, that power worked. Until reality stopped cooperating. Because real life doesn't pause neatly between photo releases. It leaks. It interrupts. It contradicts. Unless it's been carefully walled off. This is where the story starts to feel less like a mystery and more like a study in narrative control. Public images presented continuity, private observation suggested stasis. And the gap between those two realities widened just enough that people began to wonder which one was doing the lying. That's a harsh word. But it's the word people reach for when they feel misled. One neighbor recalled seeing a widely circulated family image and feeling disoriented. Not angry, just confused, because it didn't match anything they recognized from their own daily experience of the house. No increased activity before or after, no visible preparation, no aftermath, just an image appearing online as if dropped into the world from outside time. That dissonance matters because it erodes trust. Not all at once, slowly, like water wearing down stone. And once trust erodes, every new image is interrogated more closely. People start noticing framing choices, cropping, backgrounds that reveal nothing beyond what's absolutely necessary, interiors that feel staged rather than lived in. Again, none of this is proof, but proof isn't what drives belief. Coherence is, and coherence was slipping. There's another layer to this that doesn't get discussed often because it feels technical, almost boring: metadata. Dates, release patterns, images used to follow events, now they seem to float independently. A photo might appear days or weeks after the supposed moment it represented. That's not inherently suspicious, but when it happens consistently, it becomes noticeable, especially when it coincides with moments of public scrutiny. Images appear not to document life, but to manage reaction. And that's a subtle but critical distinction. One media professional, speaking off the record, described it as image buffering, the practice of releasing content not to share, but to cushion, to absorb impact, to redirect attention. That works when the underlying reality is stable. It fails when reality itself is in flux, because then the buffer starts to feel like a barrier. And barriers invite force. That's what began to happen here. Not force in the literal sense, but cognitive pressure, the pressure of unanswered questions. Why now? Why this image? Why this framing? Why this silence in between? And perhaps most importantly, why does none of this seem to intersect with the lived environment of the house? It's one thing to control the media. It's another thing to control reality so completely that no unplanned overlap ever occurs. That level of separation is difficult to sustain, unless you're willing to sacrifice something: spontaneity, authenticity, and sometimes presence. This is where irony sharpens. The Sussex narrative has long emphasized truth, lived truth, speaking one's truth, reclaiming narrative from institutions that distort it. And yet, here was a narrative that felt increasingly institutional in its precision, carefully timed, carefully framed, carefully insulated from contradiction. That contradiction didn't go unnoticed. People began asking a different question now, not about the children directly, not about the marriage explicitly, but about why everything felt so managed, what was being managed, and for whom. One neighbor described feeling like the house existed in two parallel realities, one online, one offline, and the two rarely intersected. That's not sustainable forever. Eventually, something gives. Either reality intrudes on narrative, or narrative collapses under the weight of reality it's trying to suppress. The midnight departure felt like one of those moments, because it wasn't framed, it wasn't contextualized, and it wasn't smoothed over. It simply happened. And in its rawness, it exposed how much effort had been going into preventing moments like that from happening at all. After that night, images stopped feeling reassuring. They felt defensive, as if they were responding to something, not sharing something. That shift was subtle, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. The smiles felt tighter, the settings felt more controlled, the timing felt strategic, and the absence of anything unscripted became glaring. People began asking if this is what's being shown, what's being withheld, and that question doesn't stay contained. It bleeds into everything else, into how people interpret silence, into how they read body language, into how they understand departures at midnight. Because once narrative control becomes visible, it loses its effectiveness. The illusion depends on invisibility. This is where the story takes a turn, because it's no longer just about neighbors noticing things. It's about the machinery behind the image, the professionals, the planning, the decisions made not in the moment, but far in advance. Someone who had worked adjacent to that machinery described it as preemptive containment, not reacting to problems, but anticipating them. Building buffers before they're needed, that kind of planning suggests foresight. And foresight suggests expectation. Expectation of what? Of scrutiny, of fracture, of a moment when the narrative might not hold, which brings us back again to the marriage, because image management often intensifies when personal stability weakens. When unity can no longer be assumed, it has to be demonstrated, repeatedly, carefully, without error. That's exhausting, and exhaustion shows in missed beats, in delayed releases, in the growing gap between what's shown and what's felt. By the time people realized they were watching a narrative under strain, the strain had already been there for a while. They just didn't know how to name it yet, but one person did. Someone who noticed that the most recent image didn't just lack context, it contradicted timing. A detail so small it almost slipped by, almost. And once that contradiction surfaced, it opened a door that couldn't be closed again. Because if the timeline doesn't hold, then the story doesn't either. And the next chapter doesn't begin with a neighbor. It begins with a calendar and a date that doesn't make sense. Why did no one say anything sooner? That question comes up every time this story is told, usually with a note of skepticism, sometimes with irritation. If all of this was so noticeable, people ask, why didn't it surface earlier? Why now? Why after the midnight departure and not before? The assumption behind the question is that silence equals ignorance, that if people didn't speak, it must be because there was nothing to say. That assumption doesn't survive contact with places like Montecito. Silence here isn't accidental. It's cultivated, learned, reinforced. People don't move to neighborhoods like this because they enjoy sharing observations. They move here because discretion is part of the social contract. You don't watch too closely. You don't ask follow-ups. You don't connect dots out loud, even if you see them forming, especially when the people involved have money, lawyers, and global platforms. That context matters because it reframes the silence not as absence of concern, but as presence of restraint. One neighbor described it as a kind of muscle memory. You learn early which thoughts stay internal, which comments die halfway to your mouth, which curiosities you file away and never reopen. Not because you're afraid, in a dramatic sense, because you're pragmatic. This isn't paranoia, it's pattern recognition. People who've lived near high-profile figures long enough have seen what happens when boundaries are crossed, even unintentionally. A casual comment becomes a quote becomes a headline becomes a problem, and problems have a way of circling back to the person who caused them. So people stay quiet, they tell themselves it's none of their business, they tell themselves there are explanations they don't have access to. They tell themselves that privacy is a right, not a privilege. All of that is true, but silence has a cost. It doesn't erase observation, it just delays articulation. For a long time, that delay held. People noticed things, then dismissed them, or noticed them, then forgot, or noticed them and assumed they were missing context. Until the night Harry left, because that night did something the previous months hadn't. It validated unease. It gave shape to something that had previously felt too vague to name. Once that happened, the internal justifications began to weaken. One resident said it plainly, "I stopped assuming I was wrong." That shift matters more than any single observation. When people stop doubting their own perception, they begin comparing notes, quietly, carefully, with qualifiers. Have you ever noticed, "I might be imagining this, but this could be nothing but"? Those phrases are not signs of hysteria, they're signs of caution. Of people testing whether their unease exists in isolation or in community, and slowly, reluctantly, they discovered it didn't. What's important here is that no one wanted to be first. First implies responsibility. First implies exposure. So the silence held longer than it otherwise might have. Until it didn't. Because silence is only sustainable when the stakes feel theoretical. Once they become concrete, once a midnight departure happens, once the marriage feels visibly strained, once the house's stillness starts to look less temporary, silence begins to feel complicit. And that's when restraint turns into discomfort. Another factor that kept people quiet was uncertainty about intent. Observations are one thing, interpretation is another. It's easy to notice a lack of sound, it's harder to decide what it means. People didn't want to be wrong. They didn't want to attach significance to something that might have an innocuous explanation. They didn't want to become characters in a story they never asked to join, so they waited. They watched. They kept mental notes instead of written ones. And that worked until the pattern grew too large to ignore. This is where the power imbalance becomes relevant. The Sussexes aren't just famous neighbors. They are legally sophisticated, media savvy, and deeply aware of narrative warfare. People know this. They know that saying the wrong thing, even privately, could have consequences. That awareness shapes behavior. One resident described it as a low-grade background anxiety, not fear exactly. More like constant calibration, measuring words, measuring tone, measuring whether a thought is worth the risk of being misunderstood. That's not an environment that encourages openness. It's an environment that encourages silence, which is why the timing of this story is so specific. It didn't emerge when things were stable. It didn't emerge when the narrative felt coherent. It emerged when coherence fractured. When Harry left, it did more than signal marital strain. It disrupted the power dynamic. It suggested that not everything was being managed successfully. And when management slips, people feel safer speaking, if only to each other. Another reason silence held so long is that the observations didn't feel urgent. They felt strange, but not alarming. There's a difference. Alarming things demand action. Strange things invite explanation. People assumed explanations existed, even if they didn't know what they were, until explanations began to feel less plausible. That's when strange edges toward alarming. One neighbor described the moment that shift happened for them. It wasn't the midnight departure itself. It was the morning after. The house looked the same. Exactly the same. No visible change. No adjustment. No sign that anything had occurred. That lack of reaction felt wrong. It suggested that the departure hadn't disrupted routine because it wasn't part of it anymore. And that realization reframed everything that came before. Suddenly, the silence wasn't just quiet, it was intentional. And intentional silence is harder to excuse. At that point, people began re-examining their own reluctance. Why hadn't they said anything earlier? Why had they dismissed their instincts? The answer, over and over, came back to the same thing. They didn't think it was their place. That's a powerful deterrent. Privacy culture teaches people that curiosity is intrusive, that noticing too much is a moral failure. But there's a difference between respecting privacy and ignoring reality. That difference became harder to maintain once the story stopped being abstract. Once it involved potential deception, once it implicated not just a marriage, but credibility itself. This is where things get ethically messy, because speaking up doesn't feel noble. It feels risky. And in some cases, it feels cruel. No one wants to be responsible for harming children, even indirectly. No one wants to fuel rumors that could spiral beyond control, so people held back. They weighed the cost of silence against the cost of speech. For a long time, silence won, until the cost of silence began to feel higher. That's when someone did something small but consequential. They reached out, not to a journalist, not to social media, to another neighbor they trusted. They compared notes, and what they found unsettled them because the notes matched, not perfectly, but enough. The same absence, the same sense of stasis, the same unease around timing and visibility. And once that alignment occurred, silence became harder to justify, because at that point, it wasn't about being wrong, it was about being unwilling to look. That's when the conversation widened, still quietly, still cautiously. More people admitted to noticing things they'd previously brushed off. More people acknowledged that the house hadn't felt like a family home for a long time. More people said they'd felt uneasy but didn't know why. And then, inevitably, someone asked the question no one had wanted to voice. What if this isn't about privacy at all? That question reframes everything. Because if it isn't about privacy, then what is it about? Control? Narrative? Containment? Protection from something specific? Those possibilities are far more disturbing than simple secrecy. And once they're on the table, silence feels less like respect and more like avoidance. That's why this story surfaced when it did, not because people suddenly became reckless, but because restraint reached its limit. The midnight departure didn't create suspicion. It legitimized it. It gave people permission to trust their own perception. And once that permission existed, silence stopped feeling virtuous. It started feeling dangerous. But even then, no one rushed forward. What happened next wasn't an explosion. It was a leak. A slow, controlled release of information filtered through people who still cared deeply about not causing harm. That's why the details came out fragmented. That's why no one wanted credit. That's why everyone emphasized uncertainty. They weren't trying to tell a story. They were trying to make sense of one. And that distinction matters, because it explains why this isn't a clean exposé with neat answers. It's a collage of observations shaped by fear, ethics, and frustration. The silence wasn't broken by outrage. It was broken by accumulation. Too many small things adding up to something that could no longer be ignored. And that brings us to the moment silence finally fractured, in a way that couldn't be contained, not through neighbors, not through media, but through someone who had been paid to stay silent and no longer felt bound by that obligation. Someone whose role inside the Sussex orbit gave them a very different view of the house, a view that explains the quiet. And once that perspective enters the story, the question shifts again, from why didn't neighbors speak sooner to how much of the silence was never voluntary to begin with. When did his behavior change? That's the question people closest to the situation ask themselves now, usually in hindsight, usually with regret. Because at the time, nothing felt dramatic enough to name. No blow-ups, no public scenes, no single moment that screamed rupture, just a slow drift. And drift is easy to ignore when you're inside it. Those who saw Harry intermittently over the past year describe something subtle but persistent. A narrowing, less spontaneity, fewer unscripted moments, conversations that felt shorter, more contained, as if he was conserving energy or choosing words with more care than before. That alone wouldn't raise alarms. Pressure does that to people. Public pressure, legal pressure, family pressure. It compresses behavior. But this felt different, because the compression didn't lift when the pressure should have eased. If anything, it intensified. One person described it as watching someone mentally pack before physically leaving. Not a decision announced, but a posture adopted. Shoulders slightly forward, attention divided, presence partial. He was there, but not fully, and that's often the first sign that someone has begun to exit a situation emotionally, even if they haven't admitted it to themselves yet. People noticed he arrived alone more often, that he left earlier, that he declined invitations he previously would have accepted without hesitation. Again, none of this is damning, but patterns matter more than moments, and the pattern suggested withdrawal. What made it harder to dismiss was how that withdrawal contrasted with the public image being presented. Publicly, unity. Privately, distance. That contradiction creates strain not just internally but relationally. When your outer story doesn't match your inner reality, something has to give. Sometimes it's the story, sometimes it's the relationship, sometimes it's the person. Those around Harry noticed changes in his tone first. Less humor, more guardedness. Jokes that didn't quite land or didn't come at all. He listened more, spoke less. That can be maturity, or exhaustion, or resignation. Context matters, and in this context, it felt like something closer to resignation. One acquaintance said that conversations began to feel transactional, not cold, exactly, but purposeful, as if every interaction had a beginning and an end already defined. That's not how people behave when they feel settled. It's how they behave when they're bracing. Another described noticing how often Harry checked his phone, not compulsively, but strategically, as if waiting for updates, or clearance, or confirmation. That kind of vigilance doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from uncertainty, from not knowing what's going to happen next. And uncertainty, sustained over time, erodes intimacy. People close to the situation also noted a shift in how Harry spoke about the future. Not pessimistic, just vague. Plans became conditional. Maybe, we'll see, depends. Those are small words, but they carry weight when they replace certainty. When someone stops projecting themselves forward, it's often because they don't know where they'll land, or who they'll land with. This is where it's important to slow down and avoid overinterpretation. People change, circumstances shift, stress accumulates, but change becomes significant when it's directional. And this change had a direction. Away. What's particularly striking is how this behavioral shift seemed to precede the midnight departure by months, meaning the exit wasn't reactive. It was culmination. People often imagine departures as impulsive acts driven by emotion, but the most consequential departures are usually the opposite. They're calm, calculated, preceded by long periods of internal debate. That calm is what unsettled witnesses that night. The lack of visible distress. It suggested resolution, not confusion. And resolution doesn't appear overnight, which raises the question, what had already been decided? Another detail surfaced when people began comparing notes. Harry's physical presence seemed lighter, not weight exactly. More like he was carrying less of himself into spaces. He smiled, but his eyes wandered. He nodded, but his attention drifted. He was polite, courteous, present enough to function, but not rooted. One person described it as someone who's already halfway gone. And that description stuck because it aligned with other observations, like how Harry began spending more time away from the house even before the midnight exit. Short trips, longer absences. Explanations offered, but not elaborated. No sense of ease. What happens inside a marriage when separation becomes procedural? Not emotional, not explosive, procedural. That's the word that keeps coming up from people who noticed the shift after Harry left. Not chaos, not grief. Order. Too much order. Because when relationships are still fighting for survival, things are messy. Voices rise, decisions stall. People hesitate. There's friction. Here, there was efficiency. And efficiency is rarely the language of reconciliation. In the days following the midnight departure, those on the periphery noticed a subtle tightening. Not panic, not urgency, tightening, like a drawstring being pulled quietly, one notch at a time. Schedules became more rigid, access narrowed, communication shortened. The house didn't grieve his absence. It adapted to it. That distinction matters. When someone leaves a functioning partnership unexpectedly, the environment reacts. People scramble. Adjustments are visible. The absence creates noise. Here, the absence seemed to slot into place, as if space had already been made for it. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility, that the separation wasn't a rupture, but a transition already in motion. People familiar with long-term relationship breakdowns will tell you this isn't unusual. Many marriages don't end with a dramatic moment. They end with a series of quiet recalibrations that eventually make separation feel inevitable rather than shocking. One person described it as watching two people stop accounting for each other. That's a precise phrase. Accounting for someone means you consider their movements, their needs, their reactions. When that stops, the relationship doesn't collapse immediately. It just loosens. And loose structures don't fall right away. They sag first. That sag had been visible for some time. According to those who noticed it, joint appearances became rarer. And when they did happen, they felt choreographed rather than shared. Eye contact shortened. Touch felt symbolic, not instinctive. Smiles appeared on cue. None of this is unusual in high-profile couples under stress. What made it notable was the persistence, the lack of recovery, the absence of any counterbalancing moments of warmth. Usually, when couples sense public speculation, they overcorrect. They display unity more aggressively. They close ranks. Here, the response was different. There was no overcorrection, just continued separation masked by stillness. That's often a sign that the internal decision has already been made, even if the external announcement hasn't. Another detail surfaced that supports this interpretation. Advisors. People noticed a change in who was present and who wasn't. Different professionals appearing at different times. Fewer shared meetings, more compartmentalization. That kind of structural separation doesn't happen unless there's a reason, and that reason is rarely temporary. Temporary problems are handled together. Permanent ones are handled separately. Which brings us to the question everyone avoids asking directly. Is this marriage already over in all but name? That question feels invasive, premature, almost rude, but behavior invites it. When couples stop moving as a unit, observers will inevitably wonder whether the unit still exists. And again, the house itself told part of that story. After Harry left, the rhythms didn't change to accommodate his return. That's crucial. There was no sense of until he comes back, no visible holding pattern. Everything continued as if this configuration were the new normal. That suggests acceptance, or at least preparation. People who've lived through separations recognize this phase. The liminal space where nothing has been declared, but everything has shifted. Where logistics take precedence over feelings. Where silence replaces argument. Where avoidance feels safer than confrontation. That's not reconciliation territory. That's exit territory. What complicates this further is the public narrative. Publicly, nothing had changed. No statements, no acknowledgments, no signals of strain. The disconnect between public stability and private separation is emotionally taxing. Maintaining it requires discipline. and discipline has a shelf life. One person close to the situation noted that Meghan's movements became more controlled after the departure, not more frantic, more deliberate. Fewer spontaneous outings, more reliance on intermediaries, a tightening of the circle. That's not necessarily a sign of distress. It can also be a sign of consolidation. When someone senses loss of control in one area of life, they often compensate by increasing control elsewhere. That can look like confidence. It can also look like rigidity. Which one it is depends on what's driving it. Another person observed that discussions about the future, when they happened at all, were framed in institutional terms rather than personal ones. Not we, but the foundation. Not our plans, but the work. Language reveals priorities. When the language of partnership disappears, something else has taken its place. That doesn't mean affection is gone. It means it's no longer the organizing principle. And marriages without an organizing principle don't hold indefinitely. They persist until the cost of pretending exceeds the cost of ending. The midnight departure may have been the moment that balance tipped. Because leaving at that hour isn't just about privacy. It's about minimizing interaction, avoiding discussion, reducing friction. It's what people do when they don't want to negotiate anymore. Which raises the question, had negotiations already failed? People who noticed Harry's earlier withdrawal believe so. They describe a man who had already moved through the stages of argument, compromise, and resignation. By the time he left, the emotional work had been done. What remained was logistics. And logistics are cold. They don't argue. They don't hope. They execute. This interpretation aligns with what happened next inside the house. Decisions that would normally involve consultation appeared to be made unilaterally. Access tightened further. Information flow narrowed. Boundaries hardened. Those are not the actions of a household expecting reunification. They are the actions of a household preparing for a new configuration. And that's where the children, once again, enter the story. Not as subjects, but as leverage. Because children complicate separation. They anchor people together legally, emotionally, publicly. They force continued interaction. They limit clean breaks, which is why how children are positioned during separations tells you a great deal about what kind of separation is underway. In this case, the positioning felt abstract. There were no visible custody rhythms, no observable transitions, no sense of shared parenting logistics playing out in real time. That absence is striking, because even the most private families reveal some trace of co-parenting activity. Here, there was none, which raises the uncomfortable possibility that the separation had been structured to minimize that complexity. That possibility doesn't require conclusions, it requires acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that something about this situation doesn't follow expected patterns. And when expected patterns fail, people look for alternative explanations. This is where divorce speculation enters the frame, not as gossip, but as inference. Divorce isn't always announced. Often it's implemented quietly before it's acknowledged publicly. Assets are reviewed, advisors consulted, narratives prepared. Only later does the statement arrive. The calm after Harry's departure fits that model uncomfortably well. There was no visible attempt to pull him back. No performative display of unity. No rush to reassure. Just continued control. That's often a sign that reassurance isn't the goal. Stability is. Stability of brand. Stability of structure. Stability of narrative. But narrative stability can't hide relational instability forever. Eventually, cracks show. They show in body language, in scheduling, in who stops showing up, and in who starts making decisions alone. One person described noticing a change in how Meghan interacted with staff after Harry left. More directive, less consultative. That's not inherently negative. But in context, it suggests a shift in authority, and authority shifts when power dynamics change. Which brings us to the possibility that this wasn't just a marital separation. It was a reassertion, a reclaiming of control in the wake of loss. If that's true, then the marriage didn't just fracture. It realigned around a different center, and Harry's absence became not a crisis, but a variable to be managed. That reframing is emotionally brutal, but it's also efficient. And efficiency seems to be the dominant theme here. Efficiency in silence, efficiency in image control, efficiency in separation, which leaves one lingering question. If the marriage is already operating as if it's over, What's keeping it officially intact? The answer to that isn't romantic. It's strategic. Timing. Optics. Leverage. Divorces involving public figures are rarely just personal decisions. They are legal, financial, reputational events. They require planning, coordination, preparation, which suggests that if a divorce is imminent, it's not imminent in the emotional sense. It's imminent in the administrative sense. And that kind of imminence doesn't announce itself with drama. It announces itself with silence, with midnight departures, with houses that don't react, with narratives that hold just a little too tightly, and with instructions issued behind closed doors that make it clear reconciliation is no longer the objective. According to someone who witnessed those instructions being delivered, the language used was unmistakable, not temporary, not conditional, final. And the instruction wasn't about Harry. It was about access, about who could be seen and who could not. Because once separation becomes real, the most valuable asset isn't love. It's control of what the world is allowed to see next. And that control was about to be tested in a way no one inside that house could fully contain. Why does this rumor refuse to die? Not because it's loud, not because it's convincing on its face, but because it occupies a space people aren't comfortable leaving empty, a vacuum of explanation. And vacuums get filled. What's often misunderstood about the so-called kids question is that it didn't originate online. It didn't begin with anonymous accounts or fringe speculation. It began, quietly, in the same place most unsettling questions do, among people who didn't want to be asking it. People who had tried every other explanation first. Extreme privacy, unusual schooling arrangements, heavy security protocols, rotating residences. All of those were considered, reconsidered, given the benefit of the doubt again and again. But when each explanation failed to account for the totality of what was being observed, the question kept resurfacing, stripped of its shock value and reduced to something far more uncomfortable. Why does no one have even a single unplanned memory? Not a photo, not proof, a memory. A fleeting mundane moment that wasn't framed, scheduled, or curated. That's the part that unsettled people, because memories are hard to suppress. They form accidentally. They don't ask permission, unless the conditions for forming them are removed. This is where the rumor becomes less about existence and more about access. What people were really noticing wasn't absence in an absolute sense. It was absence from shared reality, a life lived entirely behind protocol. And protocol changes the nature of truth. One former staffer, speaking cautiously and without drama, described the environment as compartmentalized to a degree that made ordinary life impossible. That phrase deserves attention. Ordinary life impossible, not difficult. Not inconvenient, impossible. According to them, everything was segmented. Movement, sound, timing, visibility. There were rules layered on rules, and then contingencies layered on top of those. Nothing was left to chance.